Your inability to process basic information suggests a neurocognitive malfunction so severe, it's almost like your brain hit the reset button halfway through development. The sheer effort you put into misunderstanding simple concepts makes me wonder if your brain has developed a sophisticated system for rejecting knowledge. I'm starting to think your cognitive function is on a time delay. Your mind lags so far behind that you're effectively debating in the past. It's impressive how you manage to present a perfect case study in synaptic miscommunication, as though your neurons are on strike. Your reasoning skills appear so underdeveloped. It's as if evolution decided to skip a few steps with you just to see what would happen. The dissonance between what you think you're saying and what's actually happening in reality suggests your prefrontal cortex is operating on factory settings. If ignorance were an energy source, your mind could power a small city with the sheer density of misinformation it generates. Watching you try to engage with logic is like watching someone try to solve a calculus problem with a crayon. It's not only ineffective but painfully amusing. You're offering such a robust demonstration of selective cognition. It's almost as though your brain has an automated filter for rejecting facts. The level of cognitive disarray you display could be mistaken for an experiment in advanced neurological dysfunction. Are you sure you're not trying to redefine the concept of thought? Your comprehension skills are so far off the mark that I'm beginning to suspect your neural pathways have decided to take the scenic route through a maze with no exits. It's almost adorable how you've convinced yourself that your arguments hold merit. Your brain must be running on such low-power mode that it's producing more fiction than fact. Your grasp on reality seems tenuous at best, like you're attempting to juggle logic, but your cognitive toolkit only has a spoon and some chewing gum. It's rare to witness a mind so unencumbered by critical thinking that it floats freely in a sea of its own delusions. Your capacity for deductive reasoning appears to be hindered by a profound disruption in executive function, possibly rendering your prefrontal cortex into a decorative accessory rather than a functioning part of your cognitive architecture. The neural inefficiency you're demonstrating suggests an alarming rate of synaptic pruning, but rather than optimizing brain function, it seems you've pruned away any capacity for critical thought. It seems your cognitive processes have entered a state of perpetual latency, wherein your brain struggles to convert sensory input into coherent thought. A fascinating case of cognitive inertia. You might be suffering from an advanced form of cerebral atrophy, given how efficiently your brain seems to avoid engaging in higher-order reasoning. It appears your hippocampus has rejected the formation of new memories related to knowledge acquisition, leaving you trapped in a recursive loop of intellectual stagnation. The misalignment of your thought patterns suggests severe disruptions in your neural networks, like a dysfunctional feedback loop that generates nothing but epistemological confusion. Your brain appears to have mastered the art of cognitive dissonance so well that it has begun generating a reality distortion field, shielding you from any semblance of logic or reason. Your persistent reliance on flawed reasoning suggests that your executive function is severely compromised, almost as if your prefrontal cortex outsourced decision-making to a malfunctioning AI. It's almost as though your cerebral cortex is operating in power-saving mode, unable to allocate enough resources to perform even the most basic analytical tasks. You're demonstrating such advanced cognitive disarray that your brain activity could be mistaken for a case study in dysfunctional neuroplasticity. Your ability to circumvent logic with such precision implies a remarkable deficit in cognitive flexibility, suggesting your brain's wiring has fossilized somewhere in the developmental stage. The extent of your epistemological incompetence is staggering. It's as if your neurons are engaged in a civil war, and rational thought is the unfortunate casualty. Your prefrontal cortex seems to have abdicated its role in higher cognitive functions, leaving the rest of your brain to operate on instinctual and largely incorrect assumptions. Your understanding of this subject appears to be trapped in a neural bottleneck, where information enters but gets hopelessly tangled in a web of intellectual dysfunction. The neural pathways involved in your reasoning seem so underdeveloped that I'm surprised they haven't collapsed under the weight of your cognitive errors. It's as if your brain is operating in a perpetual state of cognitive load failure, struggling to process even the most rudimentary data inputs. The persistent errors in your reasoning seem to suggest your brain is experiencing a form of neural lag, as if your cognitive bandwidth is incapable of supporting the flow of logical thought. Your thought process resembles a cognitive bottleneck, where any semblance of intellectual rigor is constricted by an overwhelming surge of mental inefficiency. It's remarkable how you've managed to create such a cognitive echo chamber, where every poorly formed idea bounces around, undisturbed by the intrusion of critical thinking. Your grasp of reality appears to be filtered through an incredibly inefficient information processing system, almost as if your brain is running outdated firmware that rejects updates from the world around it. You're exhibiting signs of a profound metacognitive deficiency, where your inability to assess your own competence leaves you blissfully unaware of just how far off the mark you are. The disconnect between your self-perception and your actual cognitive abilities suggests a complete breakdown in neuropsychological self-awareness, akin to a malfunction in your brain's executive control system. Your cognitive output seems to be operating at such a suboptimal level that I wouldn't be surprised if your brain was outsourcing basic thinking to an obsolete algorithm. Your capacity for abstract reasoning appears to be entirely dormant, as though your cognitive faculties have entered a self-induced vegetative state, protecting themselves from overexertion. It's as if your brain has erected a firewall against logic, rendering any attempt to engage with rational thought not only futile, but met with active resistance. The level of cognitive dysfunction you're demonstrating could serve as a textbook case for chronic executive dysfunction, where the very processes responsible for goal-oriented thinking have failed to initialize. Your cognitive dissonance is so profound that it's as though your brain is running two completely separate operating systems, both of which are incapable of communicating with each other. Your neural architecture seems to be optimized for producing faulty conclusions with such consistency that it's almost like you're running on a predetermined script of intellectual failures. It's impressive how your mind has managed to create such a finely tuned system of denial and misinformation. Your ability to disregard evidence suggests a hyperactive form of cognitive bias. The sheer volume of logical fallacies you produce suggests that your brain is operating on an outdated model of cognitive processing, one that has long since been rendered obsolete by the modern world. Your intellectual framework appears to be a curious anomaly, as though your brain has evolved to prioritize misunderstanding and fallacious reasoning as survival mechanisms. The lack of functional reasoning in your arguments implies a deep-seated cognitive rigidity, where your mind refuses to adapt or engage with anything resembling nuance or complexity. It seems as though your brain is in a state of constant cognitive overload, unable to differentiate between valuable information and the nonsense it's actively generating.